The first drops of rain hit Sterling's face as he studied the 5 women. His instincts screamed to slam the door and pretend this encounter never happened. But the youngest one chose that moment to collapse. She crumpled to her knees on his wooden porch, her breathing shallow and rapid. The brunette immediately dropped beside her, pressing a hand to the girl's burning forehead. "Bonnie's been fighting a fever for 2 days," the blonde leader said, her voice carrying a desperation she was trying to hide. "We need shelter, just for tonight." Sterling's jaw clenched. He'd built this life precisely to avoid moments like this, moments where other people's problems became his responsibility. His cabin had 1 room, 1 bed, and supplies meant for 1 person. More importantly, it had secrets that 5 strangers couldn't be allowed to discover. But as thunder rolled across the mountains, and the girl named Bonnie shivered violently against the brunette's arms, Sterling found himself stepping aside. "One night," he said. "You leave at first light." The women filed past him, and Sterling immediately regretted his decision. They moved through his space like they belonged there, the blonde scanning his shelves with intelligent eyes while another examined his hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace. The brunette helped Bonnie to the single chair near his small table. "I'm Cora," the blonde said, extending her hand. "This is Ivy, Ruby, Della, and Bonnie." Sterling didn't take her hand. Names made things personal, and personal led to complications he couldn't afford. "Water's in the bucket," he said instead. "I'll make a fire." As he knelt by the stone hearth, Sterling felt their eyes on his back. These women weren't random travelers. The way Cora had assessed his belongings, how Ivy positioned herself between him and the others, the careful way they avoided mentioning where they'd come from, everything about them suggested they were either very smart or very dangerous. The flames caught, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. In the flickering light, Sterling noticed something that made his blood run cold. Ruby's wrist bore the distinctive mark of a rope burn, still healing. Della had a fading bruise along her jaw that makeup couldn't quite hide. These women weren't just running from something. They were running from someone who'd hurt them. Sterling's hand instinctively moved to the scar hidden beneath his shirt collar, a reminder of why he'd learned never to get involved in other people's wars. But as Bonnie's fever-induced murmuring filled the cabin, he realized he might not have a choice. Outside, the storm intensified, and through the rain-streaked window, Sterling caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line. For just a moment, he thought he saw the outline of a rider watching his cabin. When he looked again, the figure was gone, but Sterling's hands had already started trembling. Sterling moved away from the window, forcing his hands to steady. He'd learned long ago that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. But the familiar weight of being hunted settled over him like an old coat he'd hoped never to wear again. "Did you see something?" Cora's voice was sharp, alert. "Wind," Sterling lied, adding another log to the fire. "Make shadows move." But Ivy was already at the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent too much time watching for danger. Her body went rigid. "They found us," she whispered. The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Ruby's face went white. Della's hand moved instinctively to a small knife hidden in her dress. Even Bonnie, barely conscious with fever, seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. "How many?" Cora asked, her calm exterior cracking to reveal something harder underneath. "Can't tell in this weather," Ivy replied. "But if they're here, more will follow." Sterling felt the familiar ice spreading through his veins. Who exactly is they? The sisters exchanged glances, and in that moment of silent communication, Sterling saw something that chilled him more than the storm outside. These women were terrified, but they weren't surprised. They'd been expecting this. "Men who believe they own us," Cora said finally. "Men who don't accept it when their property walks away." Property. The word hit Sterling like a fist to the gut. He'd heard it before, used the same way, in a place he'd tried for 8 years to forget. A place where human beings were bought, sold, and traded like cattle. "Trafficking," he said. It wasn't a question. Cora's nod was barely perceptible. "We were kept at a ranch 3 days north of here, told we were working off debts our father owed. But the work..." She trailed off, but the haunted look in her eyes finished the sentence. Sterling's scar burned under his collar. The ranch 3 days north. He knew that place. Or rather, he knew what kind of place it was. The kind he'd helped raid once, back when he believed the law could fix everything. Back before he learned that some evils had roots too deep to pull out without destroying everything around them. "How did you get away?" he asked. "Fire," Della said, speaking for the first time. Her voice carried a fierce satisfaction. Started in the kitchen during dinner prep. In the confusion, we ran. Sterling studied her face and saw the truth there. This wasn't an accidental fire. These women hadn't just escaped. They'd fought back. Thunder shook the cabin, and in its wake came a sound that made Sterling's blood freeze. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving through the storm, getting closer. "Blow out the lamps," he ordered, already moving. "Get away from the windows." But as the women scrambled to obey, Sterling realized his worst fear was coming true. The life he'd built in isolation was about to collide with the life he'd fled from. And this time, there were 5 innocent lives hanging in the balance. The hoofbeats stopped just outside his cabin. In the sudden silence, Sterling could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then came the voice he'd hoped never to hear again, a voice that belonged to a man who should have been dead 8 years ago. "Sterling Rhodes." The voice boomed through the storm. "I know you're in there, you coward." Sterling's world tilted. That voice belonged to Marcus Dane, the man who'd put the scar on Sterling's neck 8 years ago. The man Sterling had watched die in a burning building during the raid that destroyed Sterling's faith in justice. Apparently, Marcus Dane was harder to kill than Sterling had hoped. "Open this door, or I'll burn it down with everyone inside." Cora grabbed Sterling's arm. "You know him?" Sterling's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, but his mind raced through impossible calculations. 6 men on horseback. From the sound of it, his cabin had 1 door, 2 windows, and no back exit. Even if he could take down half of them, the women would never survive the crossfire. "He's supposed to be dead," Sterling whispered, more to himself than to Cora. "Well, he's not," Ivy hissed from beside the window. "And he's got enough men to surround us." Bonnie's fever had broken, but she was still weak. Ruby trembled beside the fireplace. Della had her knife out, but what good was a blade against armed men on horseback? Sterling made the only choice he could see. He walked to the door. "Marcus," he called through the wood. "These women have nothing to do with our business." Dane's laughter was sharp as broken glass. "Our business? Boy, you cost me everything 8 years ago. My ranch, my livelihood, my reputation. You think I'd forget that?" "The raid was legal," Sterling said, though the words tasted like ash. "You were trafficking. I was running a business." Dane's voice turned savage. "And you self-righteous bastards destroyed it. But look how the world turns, Sterling. Here I am with a new operation, and you've gift-wrapped my escaped property right back to me." Sterling felt Cora stiffen behind him. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Dane hadn't just survived the raid, he'd rebuilt. And somehow, impossibly, Sterling's past had collided with these women's present in the worst possible way. "I'll make you a deal," Dane continued. "Send out the girls and I'll let you live. Keep them, and I'll make sure your death takes longer than theirs." Through the window, Sterling could see the dark shapes of riders surrounding his cabin. The storm provided some cover, but not enough. Not nearly enough. "What's it going to be, Sterling? You going to play hero again?" Sterling looked at the 5 women huddled in his cabin. At Bonnie, barely 16 and still weak from fever. At Ruby's terrified eyes. At Cora's defiant stance despite her fear. At Ivy's protective posture over her sisters. At Della, gripping her small knife like it could stop bullets. 8 years ago, Sterling had believed the law could save people like them. That justice existed for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The raid on Dane's original operation had taught him how naive that belief was. But standing here now, with 5 lives depending on his next words, Sterling realized something had changed. He no longer cared about justice or the law. He only cared about making sure Marcus Dane didn't walk away from this cabin alive. Sterling turned from the door, his decision crystallizing like ice in his veins. "Cora, can you handle a rifle?" "Yes." "Ivy?" "I can shoot." Sterling pulled his hunting rifle from the wall mount and grabbed a shotgun from beneath his bed. "Ruby, Della, get Bonnie into the corner behind the stove. Lie flat." "Sterling," Dane's voice came again. "Time's running out." "I need more time," Sterling shouted back, then whispered to the sisters. "The moment shooting starts, you stay down no matter what you hear." Cora accepted the rifle with steady hands. "How many bullets?" "4 in the chamber. Box of shells on the shelf." Sterling checked his shotgun. Both barrels loaded. "Ivy, there's a pistol in the drawer." 6 shots. Through the window, Ivy counted shapes in the storm. 6 riders. They're spreading out. Sterling's mind cataloged the tactical situation. His cabin sat in a clearing with maybe 30 yards of open ground on all sides. In daylight, it would be a death trap. But the storm and darkness evened the odds slightly. "I'm going out the window," he told Cora. "When I do, they'll focus on me. That's when you start shooting. Aim for the horses. Men on foot are easier targets." "That's suicide," Cora said. "No," Sterling replied, checking his knife. "That's war." He moved to the window, studying the positions of Dane's men. The closest rider sat about 20 yards out, barely visible through the rain. Sterling could make it to the woodshed if he moved fast enough. "Sterling!" Dane's patience was wearing thin. "Last chance." Sterling looked at the 5 women one final time. 8 years ago, he'd failed to save people just like them because he'd trusted the system. Tonight he'd trust nothing but his own hands and their combined will to survive. "Give me 10 seconds, he told Cora, then smashed the window with the shotgun butt. Sterling rolled through the opening into the storm. Rain immediately soaked him to the skin, but the downpour masked his movement. He sprinted toward the woodshed as shouts erupted behind him. The first shot came from his cabin, Cora's rifle cracking like thunder. A horse screamed and went down, its rider tumbling into the mud. Sterling reached the woodshed as muzzle flashes lit up the night. Bullets splintered wood around him, but he was already moving, circling toward the barn where he kept his horse. "Kill them all!" Dane's voice roared over the gunfire. "Burn everything!" But Sterling had learned something in 8 years of isolation that his younger self hadn't known. Sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to become something worse. He reached the barn and found what he needed: the dynamite he used for clearing stumps. 3 sticks, enough to level half the clearing. Sterling struck a match, lit the fuse, and stepped back into the storm. This time, Marcus Dane would stay dead. The explosion lit up the storm like lightning, but Sterling barely registered it. He was already moving, using the chaos to close distance on Dane's remaining men. The blast had taken out 2 riders whose horses had panicked into the trees, but that still left 4 armed men between him and the cabin. Through the smoke and rain, Sterling heard Cora's rifle crack again. Good. She was keeping them pinned down. Sterling circled wide, using the barn as cover. His boots slipped in the mud, but 8 years of hunting in these mountains had taught him to move silently, even in the worst conditions. He reached the backside of the clearing, just as one of Dane's men broke cover, rushing toward the cabin. Sterling's shotgun roared. The man went down hard. "Rhodes!" Dane's voice carried fury and desperation now. "You want to play soldier? Fine. But these women die first." Sterling's blood went cold. Through the rain, he could see Dane himself dismounting near the cabin's front wall, a burning torch in one hand and a pistol in the other. The bastard was going to try to burn them out. Sterling had 1 barrel left in the shotgun and his knife. Dane had at least 2 men still mounted and mobile, plus whatever weapons he carried personally. The odds were getting worse by the minute. But then Ivy appeared at the broken window, the pistol steady in her hands. Her first shot took down another rider before he could reach Dane. Her second shot shattered the torch in Dane's hand, plunging that side of the clearing back into darkness. "You taught them well," Dane shouted, his voice coming from somewhere near the cabin wall. "But I taught myself better." Sterling heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked. Dane had found better cover and better angles. This was about to become a siege, and Sterling's side was running low on ammunition. That's when Ruby appeared in the doorway. "No!" Sterling and Cora shouted simultaneously, but Ruby was already moving, limping toward the well in the center of the clearing. She moved like someone in shock, stumbling through the gunfire as if she couldn't hear it. One of Dane's remaining men took aim at her. Sterling didn't think. He just ran, breaking cover and sprinting toward Ruby as fast as his legs could carry him. The gunshot split the air where Sterling had been standing a heartbeat before. He tackled Ruby to the ground behind the stone well just as another bullet sparked off the rocks above their heads. But now Sterling could see what Ruby had been trying to reach: a rusty metal bucket that had been knocked over by the earlier gunfire. Inside the bucket were more dynamite sticks, forgotten from when he'd been clearing the field last spring. Ruby looked at him with eyes that weren't shocked at all. They were calculating. "I counted 3 more men," she whispered. "If you can get them grouped together." Sterling stared at this woman he'd dismissed as fragile. Ruby wasn't in shock. She was executing a plan. "How long a fuse do you need?" she asked, pulling matches from her dress pocket. As another volley of shots rang out from the cabin, Sterling realized he'd underestimated all 5 sisters. They weren't just victims who'd escaped. They were fighters who'd learned to survive by being smarter than their enemies. If this story is touching you in any way, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with someone who loves a good Western tale, and subscribe to the Western Redemption channel. Every single day at exactly 10 a.m., a brand new story drops, packed with emotion, justice, and redemption. So turn on the notification bell and don't miss the next chapter, because out here in the West, no one waits around. Sterling grabbed the dynamite while Ruby struck a match. The fuse caught, hissing in the rain. He had maybe 30 seconds before the clearing became a crater. "Can you make it back to the cabin?" he asked Ruby. She nodded, already moving. "Draw them toward the trees on the left. I'll tell the others." Sterling waited until Ruby reached the cabin door, then broke cover, firing his shotgun's last barrel at the tree line. The muzzle flash gave away his position instantly, just as he'd intended. "There," Dane's voice carried over the storm. "All of you, converge on the well." Sterling sprinted toward the left side of the clearing, the lit dynamite in his hand. Behind him, he could hear horses thundering across the muddy ground. Dane's remaining men were following exactly as planned. 20 seconds left on the fuse. Sterling reached the edge of the tree line and dove behind a fallen log. Through the rain, he could see 3 riders bearing down on his position, with Dane himself bringing up the rear on foot. 15 seconds. Sterling waited until they were almost on top of him, then hurled the dynamite toward the center of their group. The stick tumbled through the air, its fuse sparkling like a deadly star. 10 seconds. The riders saw it coming and tried to scatter, but their horses were already spooked by the earlier explosions. 2 of them collided trying to turn, sending both men sprawling into the mud. 5 seconds. Sterling pressed himself against the earth and covered his head. The explosion shattered the night. Trees groaned and fell. Horses screamed. And when the ringing in Sterling's ears finally faded, he heard something that made his blood sing with fierce satisfaction. Silence. Sterling raised his head. The clearing looked like a battlefield. Smoke drifted through the rain, and debris littered the ground. Of Dane's men, there was no sign. But Marcus Dane himself still stood, battered and bloody but alive, near the cabin's front wall. In his hand was a pistol pointed directly at the broken window where Cora crouched. "Everybody dies," Dane screamed, his voice raw with pain and rage. "You hear me, Sterling? Everybody dies tonight." Sterling was too far away. His weapons were empty. There was no way he could reach Dane before the man pulled that trigger. But he'd forgotten about Della. She came through the cabin's front door like a wildcat, her small knife gleaming in the firelight. Dane spun toward her, but Della was already inside his guard, the blade finding the gap between his ribs with surgical precision. Dane's shot went wide, the bullet splintering wood harmlessly above Cora's head. He staggered backward, staring down at the knife handle protruding from his chest. "That's for every girl you ever hurt," Della said, her voice steady as stone. Marcus Dane collapsed to his knees, then fell forward into the mud. This time, Sterling knew, the man would stay dead. As the storm finally began to break overhead, Sterling walked back toward his cabin. The 5 sisters stood together in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light inside. His peaceful, solitary life was over. But looking at these 5 women who'd fought like warriors to survive, Sterling realized he didn't mind. Some things were worth more than peace. As dawn broke over the mountains, Sterling sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sisters bury the last of Dane's men in the clearing. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp. But one question still gnawed at him. "Cora," he called as she walked past carrying a shovel. "I need to know how you found me." She paused, exchanging glances with Ivy. "You won't like the answer." "Tell me anyway." Cora set down the shovel and sat beside him on the wooden steps. There was a woman at Dane's ranch. Older, maybe 50. She worked in the kitchen but wasn't like us. She'd been there longer, knew things. Sterling felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What was her name? Martha. Martha Crane. The coffee cup slipped from Sterling's hands, shattering on the porch boards. Martha Crane. The name hit him like a physical blow. 8 years ago, she'd been the key witness in the raid on Dane's original operation. Sterling had helped her escape during the chaos, got her to safety, watched her testify. "She's alive?" Sterling's voice came out as a whisper. "Was," Ivy corrected grimly. "Dane shot her 2 days before we escaped. But before she died, she told us about you. Said there was a man who'd helped her once. a lawman who'd turned his back on the law when he saw how broken it was. Sterling's hands were shaking. Martha had survived 8 years in that hell, only to die just before these women found freedom. The weight of that sacrifice settled on his shoulders like lead. She said you'd understand what it was like to run, Cora continued, that you'd help us because you knew what it meant to lose everything fighting people like Dane. She told you where to find me? Not exactly. Ruby approached from the clearing, overhearing. She said you'd gone north to the high country, somewhere past the logging camps. We searched for 3 days before we found your cabin. Sterling closed his eyes. Martha Crane had spent 8 years planning for this moment, preparing for the day when she could send other victims to the one person she knew might help them. She died knowing her sacrifice would save these 5 women. I should have gone back for her, Sterling said. After the trial, I should have made sure she was safe. She didn't want to be saved, Della said, joining the group. She told us she stayed to help others escape when she could, to gather information. She said someone had to stay inside to be the voice for those who couldn't speak. Sterling stood up abruptly, the weight of 8 years of isolation suddenly crushing. He'd spent all this time believing he'd failed, that walking away from law enforcement had made him a coward. But Martha had known better. She'd known he was exactly where he needed to be. What happens now? Bonnie asked. She was stronger today, her fever completely broken. Sterling looked at the 5 sisters standing in the morning light. They'd lost everything but each other. They had no money, no home, no family beyond themselves. But they were alive, and they were free. Now, Sterling said, you have a choice. I can take you to the nearest town, help you start over somewhere safe. Or, he paused, looking at his small cabin, then at the vast mountain wilderness stretching endlessly around them. Or you can stay. Help me build something bigger than one man hiding from the world. The sisters looked at each other, that silent communication passing between them again. But this time, Sterling could read the answer in their eyes. 6 months later, Sterling stood in the doorway of what was no longer a small cabin. The sisters had worked alongside him to expand it into something resembling a proper house, with separate rooms and a larger kitchen. Ivy had proven remarkably skilled with carpentry, while Ruby had turned out to have a gift for growing things in the mountain soil. The Henderson family will be here by noon, Cora announced, checking a list in her neat handwriting. That makes 8 families we've helped relocate this month. Sterling nodded, adjusting the sign they'd carved and mounted beside the front door. It read simply, Safe Haven. Below it, in smaller letters, all who flee injustice welcome. What had started as 5 women seeking shelter had become something neither Sterling nor the sisters had planned. Word spread quietly through networks of people who knew people, whispered in kitchens and shared in cautious conversations. Soon, other families fleeing impossible situations began finding their way to Sterling's mountain refuge. The supply run went well, Della reported, riding up with a pack horse loaded with medicine and food. She'd become their link to the outside world, trading furs and crafted goods for necessities in the distant towns. And I have news. The federal marshals finally shut down the Copper Creek operation. Sterling felt a familiar satisfaction. Each trafficker they helped expose, each victim they assisted to safety, was another step toward honoring Martha Crane's sacrifice. Bonnie emerged from the expanded cabin, her cheeks pink with health and her arms full of laundered clothes. The sickly girl who'd collapsed on his porch had grown into a capable young woman over these months. The new family's room is ready, she announced. Sterling looked around at what his isolated life had become. The clearing that had once known only silence now rang with voices, laughter, and the sounds of people building something together. His careful solitude had been replaced by purposeful community. Do you miss it? Ivy asked, joining him. The quiet? Sterling considered the question. 6 months ago, he would have said yes without hesitation. But watching Ruby teach a rescued child to read, seeing Cora organize supplies for winter, knowing that Della's trading routes were becoming underground railroads for the desperate, he realized his isolation had never been peace. It had been waiting. No, he said finally. I don't miss it at all. As the Henderson family's wagon appeared on the distant trail, Sterling felt Martha Crane's presence in the mountain wind. She'd known this would happen, had known that sometimes the only way to heal from helping people was to help more people. The 5 sisters had knocked on his door 6 months ago, seeking shelter for one night. Instead, they'd given him back the life he'd thought he'd lost forever. Sterling Rhodes was no longer a man hiding from the world. He was a man determined to change it, one rescued family at a time, and he was no longer doing it alone. The wagon drew closer, carrying another family toward safety, toward hope, toward the sanctuary that 5 lost sisters had helped him build in the wilderness. Sterling smiled and walked out to meet them. Wow. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where courage and justice collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.